Hey, this is John. How are you today? I'm continuing the build of the Hasegawa Maschinen Krieger Ammoknight. I have the model gloss coated, and I went ahead and put the decals on. I didn't figure that was something so noteworthy that it needed to be documented in video. The next step I'm going to do is add some panel line wash around the various panel lines and the bolt detail and things like that. I'm going to be, if you read the patron blog about some additional information on detailing the tractor that the Porsche diesel tractor that I recently finished, I jokingly referred to the process of MDC, multimedia detail clarification, and I kind of say that tongue-in-cheek. I'm going to be doing a little of that. I'm going to start off enhancing the panel lines just a little bit with a mechanical pencil. I first saw Daniel Zamarbide do this in his FAQ book for aircraft, and I like the technique because quite often when you're using, whether it's acrylic, oil, enamels, when you're doing panel line work and pen wash work and things like that, sometimes if you don't get the mix just right, the ratios just right, you don't shake up your enamel just right, or maybe it's gotten a little grainy, there can be little places along a panel line that aren't, the color is not as intense or the wash doesn't fully get in there. But by going in ahead of time with this mechanical pencil, you line everything and darken it up. It's not always enough to do it just with this. On some models that have very petite panel lines, it would be. But I like using this because it kind of enhances those things and lets the wash work even better, in my opinion. So let me get prepared and I'll show you what I do with that briefly. All right, what I've got here is my mechanical pencil with a 0.5mm lead, and I just click out a few clicks of lead, and I keep a heavy sanding stick nearby. This is a 100 grit, so it's pretty strong, and I just roll the pencil along it until I get a nice sharp point, and I simply grab the model and I draw into the panel line or detail that I want to work on. And this works well over, it works best over a matte surface, but because of the texturing on this model, it's working fine over a gloss surface. But I just go in and I draw in the panel lines, and it's hard to see that because that was already in shadow, but when I put the wash in, that will give it a good basis for a nice dark color. And then I go around this rivet detail and other details like this, and I just simply draw it in. It looks a bit stark at first because there's very little gradient, there's very little transition, but when the wash is applied over it, that's when the magic happens. It really makes your panel lines stand out. So I'll go through and do this. I'll continue to do a few panel lines, sharpen the pencil, do a few. It dulls very quickly. Not the process, the pencil. but I'll get the rest of the model done, and we'll take a look at how he's coming along when I'm finished with that. Okay, using the mechanical pencil, I've penciled in all the panel lines and around the rivet detail, and I'm ready to move on to the next step of giving it an oil wash. One note about using the pencil, it's also great for chips. You can put it on before your varnish coats or after. If you put it on after, you get a nice shine to it. It's also really good if you've got an area where there's a panel line that isn't fully formed or you forgot to scribe it back in. You can actually draw it in, and even from just a few inches away, it looks like the panel line. So this mechanical pencil is a handy little tool. I'll get the wash ready and we'll move on with that step. All right, I've grabbed some MiG Productions Dark Wash. You can use any wash. This is just what I have handy. And I've always heard people say, make sure you give them a good shake. I recommend giving them a good stir. Get you a handy little stir tool. These things are really great. I've gone through several of these, but I've never had this happen. I was just stirring up my wash with this one, and I started smelling something burning, and apparently I have used this so much, I've burned it out. So I'm gonna have to get another one. So if you've ever wondered how long will these last, well, this one's been around about 2 years and it's gotten a lot of use, so that's going to need a replacement. But I've got the wash in my little palette here, and I'm just using it neat. I haven't thinned it at all. I'm just going to put it directly onto the model, and it's a simple process, so I'm not going to go through doing everything, but I just get a little bit of the wash. Let me get my optivisor down so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm not really super neat about it, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back with some odorless thinner, and I'm going to clean up the edges, clean up the tide marks, and do a little bit of blending, because I want a really good shadowed effect around these details. So by giving myself a little bit of, yeah, that's what I want right there. I have to get the brush loaded up. I put a fairly heavy line around them because it gives me plenty of material to then shade, to blend back, I guess you'd say, because I not only want it to appear in shadow, but I want it to appear grimy. So using a little bit of extra wash, not being too neat about it, letting it be a little thick, will help in that process. Same way with the panel lines. I don't want just dark panel lines. I want grimy panel lines. So having a little bit spill over is okay, because I can blend that back and end up with the effect that I want. So I'll continue around the model that way and show you what I end up with and move on to the next steps. All right, I've got the wash applied around the model, well, around this part of the model that I'm demonstrating on. And what I do next is I go in, this is an old kind of knackered round brush. It's a small round brush. It says the size is 10-0, but it's just seen better days. But what I do, and I've done a little bit of it here, is I go in where I've already applied the wash, and using this dry brush, I just begin blending it in, because I want a grimy look. And you can see the color coming off on it. It's removing some of the color, but I'm also pulling it down, because what that allows me to do is to start developing streaks from the various bolt detail. And it's very subtle. This was a little stronger right here, but it's very subtle. And what it allows me to do is decide, like that one you can see is a lot darker. In fact, there's probably some still wet in there. That's okay. I'm working on a deadline, so I'm okay with that. I'll streak that down. It's kind of severe right now, but what I'll go back as I go through this process, what I'll go back and do is then use another brush that's damped in odorless thinner, and I'll reduce this a little bit. And I can even pull it completely away if I decide that I don't like it. But by using a dry brush at the beginning, I kind of start developing some of the weathering a bit, some of the streaking and all of that, and I make use of the wash that's already sitting there in the panel lines. You can go in with the wash, put it on, use a Q-tip and wipe off all the excess, and you're left with a nice look. But I feel like this way kind of speeds up the process, because later steps might involve putting on oils and blending them more to develop more shadow. By doing it right now, it's just saving a little bit of time and moving ahead in the process. Here you can see another area right here. Let me get it up closer to the camera, make sure that I'm reasonably centered. And I just dab away at it like that. And I just kind of keep doing that until it starts looking like I want. And like I said, if it's a little too severe, then I can leave it at this point. I can say, okay, I'm just going to leave it right there, let it dry a little more, come back with some odorless thinner and further blend that. And I'll have the option of doing this. I've waited as much as 24 hours to go back and blend that in like that. If I have to, I've got to go to the office, got to do, things around the house or whatever. So they're very flexible to work with. So as I say over and over, I'll continue doing this and show you what it looks like when I'm done. All right, I've got everything blended in that I want. And what I'll do now is I'll get another brush I'll keep that other one for dry work. This one is a 0 round brush. Again, it's seen better days. And I'm just going to get some odorless thinner that I've got in the palette here, and I'm going to offload most of that onto this little paper towel piece. And all I'll do at this point is I'll start blending this away like that and bringing that streak down and getting it to look like I want. And you can keep blending this and blending this and blending this until there's nothing left. Occasionally reloading the brush, wiping it off, because you're essentially removing excess. And the beautiful thing about working with oils and enamels, if I want to, I can start pulling it back up into it. And then bring it back down like that. And it's then just a process of working. I'm having trouble seeing between my visor and trying to avoid the camera and keeping it on camera. But it's just a process of continually working that and working it down in the direction that it would streak. And if you get a little, like I've got a little that ran down here and I just want to move that out of the way, I just blend it away. And then I give it the old normal viewing distance. And I continue working all the way around with each of these streaks just like that. Like this guy here. I'll go in, we'll streak him right across that decal. All right, my camera has a limit of 10 minutes filming, and on the last segment I went over that. So if this looks a little different than it did from the last cut, I apologize. I've tried to recreate it. The last thing I did was I used a dry brush to streak and blend some of the enamels that I had put around the bolts and the panel lines and stuff. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take another brush that is, again, has seen better days, same size, same type of brush, 0 round brush. But this time I'm going to dip it in odorless thinner. I'm just using the stuff from the art store. I'm not using any model specific brand, but they all work. And getting my optivisor in place. Now I'm going to start blending and pulling that down, cleaning it up a little bit. You can even pull the wash back into the detail that you're working on. And I'll just go in, and this is a subtractive process. When I've used in previous videos where I've talked about using acrylics and talking about being an additive process, you keep building it up. With this, it's more about taking it away until you get precisely what you want. And you end up with some nice streaks and fading. And if it, see how that I pulled that color down. I don't worry about getting all of it away because it just adds to the randomness of the armor suit. And if you don't like it in one area, you can even go in and just clean it up completely. Like this. And you're just left with a wash around the bolt detail. So I'll continue on around. It'll take a little while to get all of these bolts, and it's not a lot of panel lines, but all of these bolts will take a little while. But I'll continue on around and get all of those done across the suit, and then I'll give it a little drying time, probably a day, and then continue with additional weathering and get into the chipping. All right, I have all of the panel lining and initial washing done on the model. There wasn't a lot to do, but I wanted to give it time to dry overnight. And that's been done, so I'm going to start the chipping today. Now my plan on this is for the chipping to be fairly light. Fairly light for me. I have a hard time with restraint when it comes to chipping. But what I'm going to do is in these areas where I've got the green color, I'm going to chip with the base color. The base color was Tamiya XF60. So I'm going to chip these green areas with the base color to suggest that this was added on later. And then I'll chip the base color, the XF60, the tan, with a brown chipping color, and maybe go in and add it in a few of the larger areas over the green, add some of that brown in, and then maybe in a few areas just use some graphite to suggest a deeper material. I'm not sure on that yet. But to do this chipping, I'm going to start off doing paintbrush chips. I've got some of the Tamiya XF60 in my palette. I added about as much thinner. I used Tamiya's X20A out of my special bottle here. I added that in, and then I added a few drops of Tamiya paint retarder just to help me have a little longer working time. The Tamiya paint dries really fast, so when you're doing anything with a brush, it's always good to use some of that. But I've got my very cheap pointer brush. I've been testing these out. I got them in bulk for $1 a piece, and because I go through brushes fairly fast, and I've been surprised how well this one's been working. So I'm quite pleased with it. But I'm gonna start doing the chipping in the green areas to show you how I do that. I won't do it over the whole suit, but just on this part of it, and show you how I try to do that. All right, so to get started chipping, get my optivisor down, and apologies ahead of time in case I bump the camera. But I load up the brush with a reasonable amount of paint, and then I think the hardest part is finding where you want the first chip to go, and I think I'm just going to put one right along there. It would likely chip here along these edges where it opens and closes, so adding a little bit right there is probably fairly natural. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. But you just kind of, when you're painting chips on, it can be a little, for me it's a little scary, because it's quite easy to make them look like painted chips rather than natural chips. And so being very careful with the tip of the brush, I think, is important. I once went to a museum in Savannah, Georgia, the 8th Air Force Museum, and was looking at some of the planes they had hanging from the ceiling, and they were replicas. They weren't actual World War II aircraft, just replicas of them, full-scale replicas. And you could tell that someone painted them just like you would a model. I mean, they painted on the stains, they painted on the chips and that kind of thing. And the chipping on it looked painted on. I mean, it was fairly contrived looking. So when you're doing these painted on chips, it can be kind of a challenge until you get comfortable with it to make them appear natural. And I'm still not completely comfortable with it. I always do a little bit of chipping along these rivets. They project up, they're gonna catch stuff, you know, sand blasting from, you know, being out in a sandstorm or something like that. So a little bit of chipping on those is warranted. And then looking for areas that there might be a streak, you know, that it walks under a tree and it streaks along the top and causes a bit of a paint damage there. Can look for areas for things like that. But I'm just going to continue going around this part of the suit and get this chipping done with the paintbrush, and then I'll come back and show you how that looks. All right, I've got the brush chipping done on this section with the deck tan. The second thing I'm going to do is there are a few areas that I want to be chipped a little heavier, like down along here. I'm going to imagine that those pieces of armor get a little more wear and maybe a few points along here. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm just going to get a piece of sponge in these clamps and I'm going to do the old sponge chipping routine. I'll damp a little off on the paper towel there, and I'll just come in and begin touching it to the piece fairly gently, because I don't want it to just blob on there, but I do want to impart some fairly heavy chipping, which means I want to build it up. Now you can also, if you've had some areas in where you've done your paint chipping that were a little heavier, maybe a little unnatural looking, you can hit them with the sponge, and that'll add just a few random chips to it and will help make those look a little more natural. One other thing I forgot to note in the last segment was I always keep a little pool of thinner over here to clean my brush in while I'm doing chipping like that. So that's what that is over there. It's just real helpful to have that standing by. Whoa, got that a little big, but we'll live with it. Now, there's still a lot of surface area to do on this model, and I realized if I try to show as much of the chipping as I'd initially planned on doing, this video is probably going to be far longer than it already is going to be. So I'm not going to show all of the chipping. I just wanted to show these two techniques because that's what I'll apply over the whole suit, even with color changes. I'll do a color change for the tan color, and we'll go back in and do some additional chipping. So it's going to take me a bit to get all of that done. So for the sake of your sanity and mine, I'll say, suffice to say, I'm going to finish the chipping across the whole model using these two techniques, just with multiple colors. So when I get that finished, I'll come back and we'll get on to the next step. All right, with the chipping done, I'm going to start in with a little bit of oil work, and I want to do what are called dot filters. And I'm going to do them a little different. Normally dot filters, you put dots of paint on and then you streak them down. Because of the size of the scale of the suit and the fact that I'm going to be adding streaks later, I did a few experiments on a couple of other parts. I want to apply some dots of oil in a fairly random fashion around the sections of the suit. And instead of doing the traditional streaking, I'm going to do some stippling. And I'll show you what that is if you're not familiar with that term. One of the things that can get away from you real quick is putting too much color on. So be aware when you're putting on the dots that they tend to get away from you fairly quick if you're not super attentive to the number you're putting on. I'm just going to use a little bit of, I've got various colors here: Starship Filth, Raw Umber, Burnt Sienna, Yellow Ochre, and White. And I'm just going to use a few of those here. And in the green areas, I'm going to focus more on the lighter colors. In the darker areas, I'll focus, or rather in the darker areas of the camouflage, I'll focus on the lighter oils. In the lighter areas of the camouflage, I'll focus on the darker oils. I'm just going to get some odorless thinner on a flat brush, and off camera I'm going to offload most of that. And then I'm just going to come in here and begin this motion of dabbing at it. And that's spreading it around. Now at first it will look to be an awful mess, and that's okay, because we're going to keep dabbing at it and keep dabbing at it and reducing that oil so that it leaves us with a fairly grimy, varied, color shifted surface. I'm going to offload this every now and then just to get that extra paint off. And you continue in this fashion, and what you're doing is looking for the point that when you look at it and you go, that's pretty much what I'm looking for, you stop. And it can be very subtle, it can be very dramatic. It's completely up to you, of course. I'm looking for something, I guess you'd say, just to be kind of wishy-washy. I'm looking for something kind of in the middle. That's about what I'm wanting right there. And you'll notice the difference between this section and this section. It's just added a little bit of fading, tonal variation, griminess, muddiness to suggest a lot of use. Later on, I'll add in individual streaks that will help sell that notion. But that area is looking like what I want for that part of the fighting suit. So I'll continue on around the rest of the model this way and show you what it looks like when I'm done. Alright, I've gone around the armored fighting suit and continued the I don't know what you'd call it, the dot stippling, and ended up with what I kind of wanted, a very grimy, dirty, varied pattern to the surface of the model. The process I used the process as I demonstrated, but after I'd go over a section of the model and move on to other sections, I would come back and, adjust here and there if I thought that it needed a little more of one color or another. Not that I wanted it to look uniform and random, or uniform, of course. I wanted it to look random. But, in some areas I thought, I'm gonna want that to be a little dirtier, a little lighter, or whatever. The process that I'll do now, and I'll demonstrate a little of it, but certainly not all of it, will be to go in and start really narrowing down the weathering by adding in specific stains and highlights and shadows and some types of rust effect, you know, just very specific areas now, because I could, at this point, I could just about stop and be mostly happy with it. It's chipped, it's beat up, it's dirty, it's looking about 90% of what I want, but I want to add some additional streaking and stains and things like that to really sell the notion that it's been well used. So there's not a lot left to do, but what is left is very important. So I'll show some of those steps that I'm going to use to finish off this model. Okay, I'm going to use this upper part of the torso to demonstrate a few of the types of things that I'll be doing, and none of them are going to be anything you haven't seen before on other videos, so I don't want to even try and, you know, act like any of this is original to me. It's just the steps that I'll be going through, and at this point I don't necessarily do them in any specific order. It's not like, okay, I'm going to go doing, you know, some staining on all of the bolts and then do some other things. I kind of put things where I want them as I see a need for them, and depending on what color I have on my brush. As far as the materials I'll be using, I've got a couple of wells in my palette filled with odorless thinner. I'm continuing on with these oil paints, and this demonstrates how great oil paints can be for this. This is actually Saturday morning. I started with this Thursday morning. They're still viable and workable. There's a little crusty on top, but I can just dig in underneath that with a little odorless thinner and get right to the color. Another thing I'm going to be doing is using a variety of brushes. Some of them, like this brush, let me set these off to the side. Can't hold them all at once. This brush is a 0 round brush. I'll be using to apply the oils straight onto the model, and then I'll be using this brush to blend them. For more discrete areas, I'll be using this as a blending brush, and I keep my application and my blending brush separate so that I can, you know, use cleaner thinner or dirtier thinner depending on what I want to do. And then just for general stippling and streaking and things like that for larger areas, I have this one. So I've got a variety of brushes standing by to make the task easier. So let me get this one. Oh, and I've also got a piece of paper towel here. Now I want to do a few streaks around some of these bolts. And so I'm going to get some of this. Which color is this? This is the raw umber. I'm going to get some of this and test it here. You can see where I've been testing on this piece of cardboard. Cat hair. The day that I can build without cat hair can't come soon enough. Okay, don't tell my wife I said that. All right, and I'm just going to put a little up under a couple of these bolts here. And up along under here. This that I'm going to put under these smoke launchers not only helps develop a shadow, but it also gives me something to streak and stain. And I'll just take that brush, set it aside, grab my other one, and I'll start off dry. And I'll just begin working that down and seeing how that turns out. And if I like it, I keep it. If I don't, I wet it and either remove it or add more color to it. Now, I don't even know if that's fully showing up, but it's just shading just below that, the tiniest bit. And that's what I want. I want the appearance of some grime just below that bolt. And then let me come in here and grab some of this color. And again, I'm not, there may be areas that I want to do a more dramatic stain. And I'll go back in later and add some colors, like I had been messing around with it on this side, and you can see where I added some of those in. But that's one of the things I'll be doing, is just adding in a little bit of light staining around some of the bolts. Here's one that I had, this is actually where I had done the stippling effect, and I thought it developed a nice pattern there, so I just took a brush and just quickly just streaked it down like that and left that on there. So that's one of the things I'll be doing. Another thing I'll be doing as I go around the model is I want to enhance some of the panel lines so they'll stand out a little more, make them appear a little grimier. But I don't want to go in and do any post shading because that's not going to get the effect that I want. So I'm going to use a little bit of this Starship Filth. And what I'll do is I'll just get it on the brush, on a dry brush, neat as they say, wipe it off on my palette, and then I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to add some along the panel lines like that. And just get it a little grimy looking. Now, of course, the oils, because of the way I'm applying this, it looks a little stark, which is, for right now, that's fine. Then what I'll do is I'll go back with a second brush that's been damped and thinner, and I'll simply blend this back. And here I'm looking for a very subjective result. Something, you know, it's one of those, I'll know it when I see it. It starts off, you see it's kind of bleeding out, which is fine. It starts off fairly stark. And then I just keep blending it back and removing excess until I get the result I want. Now I can bring it back down into the panel line like that, and because of the way these oils work, they just slide right across the surface. And you know, I just realized before I started applying any of these oils, I forgot to mention that I gave this sucker a satin coat. So all of this is being done over a satin coat. You remember I talked about giving it a gloss coat for the decals. Before I started the oil work, I gave it a satin coat. That would have been a handy piece of information to talk about then, wouldn't it? Oh, wow. Sorry. But I'll just go through and I sit back and I look at it and I go, is that what I want? And if it is, I leave it and go on to the next part. And if it's not, I'll keep going. But that's about what I want it to be right there. So if you can see that. So that's another one of the techniques I'll be employing as I finish up the suit. Another thing I want to briefly touch on is while I'm working on the main portions of the suit. I'm also working on these smaller ancillary items, like this piece hangs up under here on the model. And I'll put it in at the end. I don't know whether it's a fuel tank or his lunchbox, or what it is, but I've gone through this and just using a variety of sponging applications and washes. This is acrylics, this is oils, this is enamels. I've just been layering it up, and it's ended up with a fairly nice looking kind of rusty look there. Is that in focus? I'm having trouble seeing. So I'm real happy with the way that turned out. I may knock back that spot a little bit. It's a little bright. But all I did was use, to get those rust effects, I just used some of this burnt sienna, burnt something. It's orangish on there. I've also been working on the gun. I'm going to do a little more sponging on that to make it look a little more worn. You can see I've got one of the ammo drums on there, and there'll be a clear lens that goes in here, so I'm going to have to do some effects. So of course, while I'm working on the main part of the suit, all of these other things are getting various treatments. And what I'll do is as I'm working on these oils, when I get done with the main part of the suit, I'll just reach over and grab one of these and add a layer and then toss it back in the box, and then come back later and add another layer. So they get worked in progress with everything else. Okay, another thing that I want to add to the model is just some rust-ish effects. I don't want it to be heavily rusted, but I want some rust-ish effects, kind of like I showed on the fuel tank just a moment ago, or the lunchbox, whichever you prefer. So what I'll do is I'll just, right here on the cardboard, and it's going to soak in to the cardboard, that's okay. I'll get some of this raw sienna, burnt sienna, one of the two. I'm not big on remembering color names. I'm not big on remembering anything. And I'll go into just particular areas, and I'll just kind of begin stippling in that color, because I want to suggest not so much that the outside of the suit is rusting, or even necessarily the bolt itself, but maybe in where the threads are, or where it was, underneath where it was riveted, that there's some rust happening and it's beginning to drain out the color. And so I'll just very subtly put that in like that. And I just keep working it until I get the effect that I want. And it's, as with any of these oils and enamels, it's mostly a subtractive process. You put some on and then you take it away until you get it like you want. And that's pretty much like I want, because at normal viewing distance, what I see is a hint of orange right there. It's a little glossy now from the thinner still being wet, but you can see I've added just a little bit of staining there, which gives a little more character to the surface. So that's another one of the steps, that as I'm going around the model, that I'll be adding in to finish it off. Okay, one other note I wanted to point out. I'm actually going to, at this point, assemble the model, at least put the legs on, put the feet on, put the shoulder armor on, because at this point I want to see the total look of the model as I'm adding these streaks. So I'll go in and add all of this together so that I can hold the whole thing, and when I look at it, I see it as a whole, not as the parts, which will help me tighten up the weathering here towards the end. So I did want to point that out so that, well, basically so that I won't forget before the next segment. So moving forward. Okay, I've applied lots and lots of tiny dots of oil and spread them around. You can see the result of that. The good thing, one of the good things about using oils is you have the ability to go back even days later and manipulate things if you want. So one of the things I'll do is when I get to the point that I say in my mind, okay, I'm about ready to call this finished, I'll just give it a look over. And at that point, and this is just my own weird way of working, but at that point, I don't generally add things, but I may reduce things a bit or change, manipulate things around. I may add something, but generally at this point, I'm calling it done. I'm not ready to do that yet, but I'm getting there. So this process of adding oils that I demonstrated in just the previous segment, what I did from a practical standpoint was I would go in and I'd put some here and put some here, and I'd put another color here and spread it around and see how they look together, and add a little more and take away a little more and smear some off. And it's a very touch and feel kind of process. And I tried to, I have a very symmetrical mind. I like things to be the same. So it's very difficult sometimes for me to weather in a non-symmetrical fashion, an asymmetrical fashion. But I tried to do that somewhat on here. But I tried to also keep some internal logic, like the rust that I'm showing on these bolts is trying to convey a sense of, okay, these rivets or these bolts were put in, and while the material outside may not be rusting, inside there's some rust happening right around where they've been originally inserted, and that's what's washing away. So I tried to convey that a little bit. There's a few places, here, I don't even know what these are supposed to be, but we'll have some staining there. There's going to be a piece of armor that goes over here. I'm going to put some soot right there because I assume that's going to be an exhaust. But I still want to do a little weathering down here on these mechanical parts. But it's really just a process of putting some things on, adding some other things, seeing how they work together, and just getting it like you like. I was really happy with how this, I'm assuming this is a fuel tank, although I've been jokingly calling it his lunchbox. I'm really happy with how that turned out. So that was kind of fun to do. But for the next step that I want to cover, it will be using pigments. For the pigments, first, when I use pigments, I put down a piece of paper towel because this stuff will go everywhere. So you may want to cover your work area with newspaper, paper towel, something like that. I'm going to be using Vallejo pigments. No special reason, they're just convenient, and it's already pre-ground in the colors that I want. But I've got some light yellow ochre, European earth, burnt umber, and carbon black. You could use the chalk kind of pigments. You could use another brand. You could use dirt. The brand isn't really that important. I just find these convenient. But there's also several ways to apply these. Let me start moving these out of the way to head towards working with them. They can be applied basically, and I know this is probably pretty obvious to say, but they can be applied wet or dry. The way you apply it in general will determine how it looks when in the end, and by that doesn't sound real intelligent to say it that way, but if you apply it wet, it will go on looking thicker and more opaque, but will dry much as if you applied it dry. but it can go faster. So if you're wanting just a light dusting of pigments, dry application is usually better. If you're wanting a heavier application, then the wet application can be better. Now, even when you're doing the wet application, just like if you were using paint, the more pigments you add to your liquid, the more opaque the result will be. I mean, you can cake this stuff on so that it's essentially thick paint. But keep in mind, and I recommend experimenting a bit with it. I need to get a real tool to get this out rather than using the end of a brush. Experiment a bit to see how the pigments behave under different applications, and they can be wiped off, but especially if your surface is matte or satin or textured like this, it can be really difficult to get them completely off. They tend to want to hang around in the nooks and crannies. But the way I'm going to be applying these, because I don't want this to look like it's covered in mud, I'm seeing this as operating more in a dusty environment. I don't want it to be like it's mud covered. I'm going to be applying them dry, and I'm going to go for a base coat of this dust color here. Which color was that? That's the European Earth. I'm going to do that as a base, and then I'm going to add a little bit of the darker and lighter just in select areas. And I only want to really have it around the bottom of the feet and maybe the bottom of his legs right here. I don't want to cover him in dust all the way up. But the way I do this is I basically just get a brush, pop it in there, and I just start kind of applying it on like that. It's almost a dry brushing motion. And again, like a lot of other paint techniques, you can build this up. You can come back and apply more, see how it looks, and get it to the thickness you want. And if it's not doing what you want, you can brush it back. And it will leave some staining, it will leave some tinting. It's fairly controllable. So I'll continue doing this, just exactly that motion, and just adding color and building it up and doing like I did with the oils and getting it to a point that I like. I'll continue doing that, and in the next segment show you what it looks like and where I'm going to go from there. Okay, as you can see by the pigments on the paper towel, I've applied several colors. What I did was I started off, as I mentioned, with this this medium color, and I covered everything in a fairly good coat up to about here along the lower portion of the leg. And then I went in with the other two colors and I just dotted them on in what I hope is a fairly random pattern. Again, I have a little trouble with it being random, but just around in a fairly random pattern. Now there's different ways to fix these pigments. If you're just going to be setting this on your shelf for display and you're not going to be handling it, you could give it a quick, puff of air and blow off the excess and set it on your shelf and it's good to go. You just can't handle it because they'll come off on your fingers. If you want to fix them a little better for handling, you can use pigment fixer, you can use odorless thinners. I've seen folks use mixes of flat or gloss medium mixed with water to kind of make it a little more permanent. What I'm going to do is add a little bit of water, because water's not going to permanently affix it, but it's going to blend some of this in. It's going to take away the graininess. It's not going to interact with the oils below. It'll dry quickly and still allow the oils to breathe. because it's going to take them a while to actually completely dry up. It still won't be in a state that I could handle it a lot or ship it. The final step that I'm going to do on this is I'm going to give it a clear varnish. I'll either use, I haven't decided yet if I want to use matte or semi, or the satin finish, but I'll put one of those on and that will permanently affix it. But for applying the water, I just get a brush and I just kind of tap it in and let whatever's going to happen. Like that. And it will mix stuff up. The colors will mix kind of like paint, but that's what I want. That's why I applied that stuff around there randomly, because in areas with the darker color, it'll mix with the undercolor, and it'll give it one look. The areas that just have the one color on it, it'll give it another. And you'll notice that it's also reducing the opacity as I'm doing this. Once it dries, that will mostly return, not entirely. And when it's dry, you may want to go back in and add another coat of it, just to get it like you want. But this is the way I like to do it, because it kind of lets me see how it's going to all look blended together. So I'll continue doing this, and once it's dry, I'll show you what it looks like. All right, I've applied the pigments. I've added some water, as I showed earlier. And I wanted to show it's almost completely dry. And I wanted to show, you'll notice there's still, let me get my brush, there's still some stuff drying right here, a little bit of drying going along here along the back of the foot, but notice how it's now reduced the level of pigment so that it gives it more of a dusty look. It looks less like it's covered in pigment and more like it's covered in dust. I think it's more to scale. I made sure to put some extra in here in these little cutouts so that it would look as if it collects, which I think would be appropriate for that little piece. I want to show you something that happened over here. Sometimes you get these little marks here. I did that by dabbing on individual dots of water with dust. And if you like those, I kind of like those. I'm not completely sold on them, but I kind of like them. But if you don't like them, it's just a simple matter of reducing them a little with your brush, just like that. And you can work them in. And now that I'm working them in, I actually like that effect a little better. But it gives it a nice effect. And you can do that. You can continue going in and adding dust, taking away dust, adding water, taking away water, until you get it exactly at the level that you want. If you want dirt clumps, just use more water and pigment and really clump it on there. If you want wet effects, you can use, there's products for that. I generally use Future for wet effects because it'll give it a nice glossy look, hold everything together. So these pigments can be very flexible. In some ways, in a weird way, they're kind of like oils in that they have a long working time. You can activate them later easily. They can be streaked, they can be blended. So in a lot of ways, I told someone recently that I was talking to about using pigments. They're kind of like acrylic oils, if that makes any sense. So they're very flexible, a great thing to have in your toolkit, and very good to make use of on your models when you're weathering them. So I've got that finished up, and the next thing I really want to do is just add all the parts on and kind of take a look at the model and assess it then and see what else I want to do, and pretty much that will finish up the Ammoknight. All right, I am ready to call this guy finished. I put on the rest of the parts, glued everything on, and I'm pretty happy with it. It's certainly not the best thing ever, but it works. After applying the powders, the pigments around the feet, I went in and added all the parts, glued everything that needed to be glued on. This had to be glued on, but I've left it so that it's movable. I added the hoses in, gave them a little bit of weathering. I added a few gloss oil stains here and here, just to give a little different finish to a couple of places. You see the guns in place, and I think it looks okay. It's not the best Ammoknight ever. I looked around the internet at a lot of them to give me some inspiration on proceeding as I built this, and there's some really good ones out there that gave me a lot of good ideas. But I'll hold it a little closer so hopefully you can see some of the features of it. Again, I'm really happy how that tank there turned out. One guy suggested it's an ice cream maker, which I think I like better than a lunchbox. But he turned out pretty good, I think. I'm working on a diorama, well, not a diorama base, but just a base to set him on. I don't know if I'm going to use it because I'm not super happy with how it's turning out, but if I do, they'll be standing like this, and the base is an oval, and they'll be at one end of it. And I plan to have a little bit of a backstory to it in the blog if I use the base. I may still have a backstory even if I don't use the base, but that may be coming. If you don't see it on the blog, you'll know I wasn't happy with it. But this video will go live before the blog does, so look for the blog in a few days after you see this, and there'll be more photos there. But I think I'm ready to just say he's done. So, sorry, Jeff Goldblum. So that wraps this up. Thanks for being a patron. Thanks for your support. Thanks for watching this video. And I look forward to seeing you in the next Patreon exclusive video. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.